Good day and gratitude, family. This is Face the Nation with Bolden Unchained again, and we're back with another reading. Tonight, we are reading at midnight with the ancestors. We are reading Racial Violence in Kentucky, 1865 to 1940. And let's get started. I'll go first. Chapter 4, Ousting Troublemakers. Mob rule, like lynchings, was another tactic used by Kentucky whites to get rid of offending blacks and to warn others of what could happen to them for overstepping their bounds. Yet, in one respect, mob rule differed from lynchings. It was done first and foremost for economic gain. Of course, the ramifications of a lynching might mean that blacks would stay in their place and not complain about working conditions. But it is obvious that in Kentucky and elsewhere, white people terrorized black people because they resented Afro Americans as successful independent farmers, skilled workers, and businessmen, all of whom, by their very presence, challenged the doctrine of white supremacy. Whites as well were often the targets of night riders and other criminal bands. During outbreaks of lawlessness, white undesirables, the vagrants and prostitutes and petty thieves, received whippings and notices to leave town immediately. On a few occasions, outspoken judges and prosecutors calling for the end of mob law and the fair treatment of Afro Americans received whippings at the hands of mobs. Unquestionably, however, the cases of whites as targets are far exceeded by the numerous attempts of white mobs to force Afro Americans to leave an area, or by the random beatings of blacks that occurred in certain parts of the state. Throughout Kentucky, there were counties that had only a few Afro Americans, even though adjacent counties might have had sizable black populations. Whites in some of the former counties had resorted to violence to get rid of Afro Americans and to let it be known that black migrants were not welcome. Several counties in regions 5, 6, and 7 that had no reported lynchings of blacks also had at the most only a handful of black residents. Afro Americans in these areas worked as domestic servants, farm hands, or common laborers, jobs considered appropriate for them by whites. Blacks encountered hostility whenever they attempted to settle in Elliott County, located in Region 6. If the figures obtained by census takers are even close to being accurate, the number of blacks living there was minuscule. In 1880, there were 43, declining to 27 in 1890, and then plunging to 2 people at the start of the new century, the 1900s. During these same years, the white population increased from 8,000 to more than 10,000. Richard Watson, one of 2 Afro Americans living in the eastern Kentucky county in the early 1900s, owned land. The target of whites who resented his success, Watson was killed in January 1909 for no reason other than his being an Afro American. The census from that year after Watson's murder recorded 1 black still living in Elliott County. Clearly, Afro Americans in many parts of the state had to stay in their place. To be outspoken meant oppression. To acquire land and other possessions could lead to them being condemned as a troublemaker and result in death. In August 1877, a group of Afro Americans was forced to leave Henry County, an area that had only a few blacks to begin with, after one of them was accused of slandering the virtue of a white woman. The incident centered on Smith Reed, Reed, a former slave, and Alice Campbell, the daughter of Reed's former master. Reed and Campbell had been friends all of their lives. As children, the white girl and the mulatto boy were very affectionate playfellows. And after both had grown up and were married, they continued to be on rather friendly terms, considering differences of color and station. Rumors began circulating that a criminal intimacy had occurred between the wife of a wealthy and respectable white farmer and a young mulatto farmer. The mob that confronted Reed with this accusation was led by a young farmer named Asher, Asher, who was not Campbell's husband, but who also seems to have been involved in a relationship with her. According to the Courier Journal, the last time Reed went to the Campbell farm, he had been prevented from seeing his longtime friend because she and Asher had locked themselves in one of the rooms in the house. A member of the mob shot Reed, though not fatally, and they debated whether or not to hang him. It was decided that Reed and all of his kin had to leave Henry County. Led by Asher, the mob took some 30 blacks to the Louisville Short Line Depot at Newburgh and purchased tickets for them on the train bound for Cincinnati. Even though some of the Reed clan had expressed a desire to go to Louisville. All of the men, women, and children were banished in this way and had to leave behind their household goods, furniture, farming implements, horses, and other stock, and their standing crops. According to the New York Times, all of the blacks either owned or rented good farms and were doing quite well. James Garnett, we believe, had 45 acres of corn and 6 acres of tobacco in prime condition. In an article headlined "The Facts, Base Slander of an Innocent Woman," the Courier Journal proclaimed its intention of setting the record straight on the forced removal of the Reed family. A local correspondent for the paper interviewed a number of Henry County whites, and all of them denied in toto the accusations of misdoings by Mrs. Campbell and defend the unceremonious ousting of the black community of which Reed was a member on the ground that it was composed of suspect characters. As the reporter explained, though Campbell had always been friendly to her father's former slave, nothing had ever happened between them until June the 29th, when Reed made an awful proposal to Campbell, who rebuked him and said that she would tell her husband. Reed then choked her, threatening to kill Campbell and her husband. When he learned about Reed's attempt to seduce his wife and the assault on her, Campbell's husband had to be restrained by friends from killing Reed. He then agreed to the forced removal of Reed and his kin from the county as the best way to avoid bloodshed. In blunt words, the Courier Journal said that Reed lied about having an intimate relationship with Mrs. Campbell. Is there a sane married man on the face of the earth that believes his wife could have a criminal intimacy with any person, much less a Negro, and he never suspected her fidelity? It is too absurd to be believed. The newspaper applauded Henry County whites for taking action against anyone who would demean the character of their women. This community has shown by her actions that she is always ready to defend virtue, and no man, be he white or black, can remain in this community and seduce or attempt to the ruin of an innocent, virtuous woman. The correspondent next discussed the character of Reed and the other blacks. As to the other parties who were sent with Reed, they have long been suspected as dangerous, bad men. Some of them have been suspected of knowing too much about the burning of certain property, thieving, and other crimes. Reed stated that he owned 50 acres of land, which is false. He never owned a foot in his life, nor did any of the rest of them. It is difficult to assess all the facts of the case. As we have seen, if a black had been accused of making a lewd proposal to a white woman, then choking and threatening to kill her and her husband, he would have been lynched. Yet Reed was not lynched. Surely at the very least, Reed would have been arrested, tried, and sent to prison for assault. Forcing Reed to leave Henry County meant that no trial would be held where the white woman might have been asked about her involvement in the criminal act of having sex with a Negro. It was typical of the white community and newspaper to cast the victimized blacks as criminals. Afro-Americans who were strongly suspected of theft or arson would have been lynched or forcefully removed from most counties in Kentucky long before the alleged incident of June 29th. In short, given the nature of race relations in Kentucky during that time, it is extremely doubtful that the version of the expulsion of the Reed family from Henry County, as reported by the Courier-Journal, is an accurate one. Extremely doubtful. The practice of forcing blacks to leave an area occurred on many different occasions between the 1880s and the 1990s and the 1930s. In many of these cases, like the one involving Reed and his clan, whites justified the ousting of Afro-Americans by claiming they were criminals or vagrants. Whites rarely acknowledged publicly the two leading reasons for forcing blacks out of their communities. They resented black involvement in politics, especially in the Republican Party, and they felt threatened by the presence of blacks as successful farmers or as skilled competitive workers. A few of these incidents received as much media attention as some of the highly sensational lynchings. More often, however, except for coverage in a small town weekly newspaper, no other records exist of blacks being compelled to leave an area. The New York Times and the Louisville Commercial, both Republican newspapers, were far more likely to carry stories of blacks being run out of a region during an election year. During the late 19th century, the Courier-Journal, a Democratic paper, rarely ran stories of blacks being forced out, except to explain why whites had resorted to such drastic tactics. Several black leaders living in the westernmost region in the state were the targets of whites a number of times during the early 1880s. Political differences lay at the root of the problem. Whites in the Democratic Party felt challenged by several blacks attempting to rally support for Republican candidates. In contrast to the Deep South, where blacks were eventually eliminated from the political arena, black Kentuckians maintained the franchise and, by voting solidly Republican, often played a significant role in close elections in Paducah, Hopkinsville, and other Western Kentucky cities. In August 1880, Henry Say, S-E-A-Y, of Hickman County, was beaten by whites and told to leave the county. The local police promised to arrest the guilty parties, but nothing came of the matter, and C.A. was forced to flee. 2 years later, a white guerrilla band began whipping black political leaders in the city of Hickman in Fulton County. After the beatings failed to stop black political activity, the heavily armed whites start shooting the blacks, though none were fatally wounded. Having no legal recourse or protection from the authorities, the beleaguered blacks left the area to the delight of the Democrats. Black politicians were not the only undesirables forced to leave town. In the late 1880s, about 15 men visited the farm of Milt Barclay, B-A-R-C-L-A-Y, in Pulaski County to punish a black tenant they accused of stealing a horse and farm equipment. According to the newspaper account, the cappers gave the Negro a sound whipping and ordered him to leave the state, which he did without further ceremony. Holding the white farmer responsible for the transgression of his tenant, the mob then gave Barclay a sound thrashing. The mob threatened to hang Barclay if he hired such an unworthy Negro again. Once word circulated about the incident, local white citizens were upset about the beating given to Barclay, but said nothing about the punishment and banishment of the unnamed African American. Sometimes a lynching sparked a movement by whites to rid their area of blacks viewed as troublemakers or as criminals. White newspapers often stated that since a lynching had at last occurred, and it could have happened to any number of black criminals found in the community, steps should be taken to compel others to abide by the law or leave town. After lynching Dick Allen, the Mayfield mob pinned a note to his body, warning 7 blacks to leave town by noon on Thursday. Nearly all of them took the advice. Their departure did not satisfy the mob. Within days, another list surfaced, naming 10 additional blacks who were to leave Mayfield, Kentucky. Noah McReynolds, NOAHMCREYNOLDS, accused of spying on a bathing white woman, balked at leaving. On Saturday night, a mob took him from his home and administered 20 lashes to his back. The following morning, McReynolds left town on the train. In all, perhaps 30 or 40 Negroes have left since the hanging. In Russellville, after the hanging of 4 black youths in 1908, the mob issued a general warning to Logan County blacks to shape up or expect similar treatment. It can be reasonably assumed that the greatest number of Afro-Americans were forced to leave communities all over the Commonwealth, not because they were warned out of town after lynchings, nor because they were involved in political activities, but because white people were determined to eliminate them from the workplace. The irony, of course, is that during labor shortages on farms or in expanding industries, whites had urged blacks to move into an area. In the early 1900s, white farmers in several western Kentucky counties complained about the shortage of black tenant farmers and sharecroppers. According to one account, 25 blacks left one community in March 1904. In urban areas, whites also needed additional black workers, but only for the lowest paying, least prestigious jobs. Although his statement should be viewed with caution, a manager of a brick-making plant in Paducah claimed in 1906 that it was impossible to hire black workers. I will venture to say that I have asked 300 colored men if they wanted work, and all but 3 of them with grins on their faces answered in the negative. Also in the early 1900s, coal companies in both eastern and western Kentucky sent agents into the South to lure thousands of blacks to work in the mines. Their reasons for wanting to hire Afro-American workers was obvious. They viewed blacks as strike breakers who would depress wages for all coal miners. Once hired in the coal fields, the blacks were assigned the worst, most dangerous jobs and received the lowest pay. But when employment was difficult to find, whites tried to undermine the presence of black people in the workforce. In Louisville, one of the few places in Kentucky where European immigrants settled, the Irish complained about the large number of successful black barbers, self-righteously proclaiming that they lacked the sense of pride for refusing to cut the hair of fellow blacks for fear of losing their white customers. Although the rhetoric was harsh, it rarely turned to violence. The coal fields and several other industries presented a different case entirely, as clashes occurred between black and white workers on several occasions from the early 1900s to the Great Depression. Signs were posted at the Chess Weymouth Stave Mill Company. Chess, Chess, Weymouth, Weymond, Stave, Stave Mill Company. Excuse me. In McFarland, Monroe County in November 1908, warning the 15 black members to quit and leave at once. White workers proclaimed that the presence of the Negroes had become obnoxious. White workers proclaimed that the presence of the Negroes had become obnoxious. In response, several residents in McFarland, sympathetic to the black workers, said that the signs and the threatened violence were the work of persons who had expected to be employed at the mills and were deprived of the employment by the Negroes. This group urged blacks to ignore the threats. Nevertheless, the black workers took seriously the warnings, quickly gathering their belongings and left the area. The night riders were largely responsible for the ousting of blacks from parts of western Kentucky in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. An agreement by the American Tobacco Company and several European tobacco concerns to control prices paid to farmers led to the violence of the night riders. This tobacco trust divided up the territory, fixed prices, and refused to engage in competitive bidding. Tobacco farmers realized that steps needed to be taken to combat the monopoly created by the trust. And at a crucial meeting in Guthrie on September the 24th, 1904, they formed the Dark Tobacco Association, later changing the name to the Planters Protective Association of Kentucky. Their purpose was clear: to regulate the price they received by pooling and holding their tobacco crop until the trust met their price. After the crop was stored in warehouses, the association would arrange for the grading, financing, and selling of the tobacco. In the first year of the plan, the association sold 70% of the tobacco grown in Kentucky. The trust grudgingly increased its price, and all farmers, even those who had remained aloof from the organization, received higher prices for their crops. Despite repeated warnings from the association that anything short of total unity would destroy the trust, many independent farmers refused to join, saying that the association's charges for selling their tobacco was too high. Deciding that only militant action would persuade the hillbillies to join, an inner circle of association members formed the Night Riders. Adopting the tactics and the regalia of the Ku Klux Klan, the Night Riders began destroying crops and burning tobacco barns. Go to bed. Go to bed. On several occasions, they invaded towns, destroying warehouses that stored the tobacco purchased by the trust. Damage ran into the millions of dollars. From the start, the Night Riders whipped and occasionally murdered their outspoken foes. Members of the outlaw band traveled to the small community of Gulf, Goff, in late March 1910 to whip all of the males in the Carroll family, Carroll. As his older brother was being severely lashed, Charles Carroll attempted to run off. Even though he was only 12 years old, and most surely not responsible for his family's unwillingness to cooperate with the Night Riders. He was killed by gunfire. Many law officers and elected officials joined the Night Riders, or at least gave tacit, TACIT, approval to their violence, thereby undermining the law's obligation to apprehend them. On the rare occasions when Night Riders were arrested and taken to court, they were provided with strong alibis from leading citizens. As one contemporary source explained, there is war in Kentucky. In a score of towns, what is virtually a state of martial law exists. In the farming districts, settlers have been fortified and loaded arms stacked within easy reach. The Night Riders eventually harassed people who had no connection with the tobacco controversy. Initially, blacks who seemed to have joined the association in the same proportion as whites were not viewed as a special target by the Night Riders. Nevertheless, at some point, they began attacking blacks in various parts of western Kentucky. In January of 1907, Night Riders destroyed the barn owned by David McGraw, McGraw, and Frank Coleman of Christian County. It is not clear why the barn was burned, unless it was the beginning of a move against Negroes, speculated a white newspaper. This proved to be the case. Farmers were warned not to employ black workers. The tobacco fields of several black sharecroppers were destroyed, even though these farmers had not expressed any opposition to the association. Night Riders next attacked blacks in Lyon County, Lyon. For no apparent reasons, members of this outlaw band went to the home of Arthur Blue, Blue, firing shots and ordering him to leave the county. When denouncing the episode, a white newspaper said, Blue has lived in Lyon County for 35 years and is one of the most industrious and respectable Negroes in the county. No possible excuse for the outrage is known. The very next evening, the home of a white farmer, John Manning, Manning, was riddled with bullets because of his refusal to dismiss his black workers. At least 6 other black families received notices to leave Lyon County, but were able to remain because, in part, of a timely intervention of Sheriff Sam G. Cash, who refused to be intimidated by the mob. On yet another occasion, the Night Riders traveled to Eddyville, Eddywille, the largest city in Lyon County, and whipped 10 men, 6 of whom were Afro-Americans. The men had publicly denounced the raids. Black workers in other Western Kentucky communities came under attack as well. In Caledonia, Caledonia, a Mr. Howell, Howell, was warned to get rid of his black workers or expect a midnight visit from the Night Riders. Black coal miners in Hopkins County, whose employment was far removed from the concern of tobacco farmers, were attacked. As a contemporary source explained, Negro laborers are an offense to the Coal Miners Union in Hopkins County, and night riding is invoked. Rural blacks in several southern states were also victimized by white bands during the early 1900s. In 3 counties in Mississippi, lawless bands calling themselves White Cappers, WHITECAPPERS. White Cappers posted signs ordering blacks to leave, whipped and murdered a number of them, and attacked whites who expressed sympathy for the Afro-Americans. Commenting on the violence in Mississippi, a scholar observes, probably no group espoused this anti-Negro sentiment more strongly than the small farmers who for so long had experienced hard times. Night Riders succeeded in forcing almost all of the black residents to leave several small communities in southwest Kentucky. Although blacks living in many different areas of regions 1 and 2 experienced the violence of the lawless band. The two main targets suffering repeated assaults were the blacks in the small communities of Golden Pond in Trigg County and Birmingham in Marshall County. Economic motives lay behind the attacks. The blacks owned good farmlands or were employed by the Tobacco Trust. Since the end of the Civil War, Afro-Americans had lived in Birmingham, a port town on the Tennessee River. Commenting on this predominantly black area, the Courier-Journal, which covered in far greater detail than did the local newspapers the violence against Western Kentucky blacks in the early 1900s, explained. Birmingham has some of the best farming land in the Purchase, and around there is to be found practically the entire Negro population of Marshall County. And around there is to be found practically every Negro population of Marshall County. Attacks on Birmingham blacks began in February 1908. Toward the end of the month, after having suffered through several raids, community leaders finally went to the authorities, pleading in vain for protection. The blacks had been told to leave Birmingham, but had refused to do so, and the mob now resorted to murder, apparently concluding that it would take more than a few warning signs and small brush fires to oust the entrenched Afro-Americans. In addition to being landowners, some of the Birmingham blacks worked at the tobacco factory in the county, which further incensed the night riders. Officials of the tobacco company were warned to fire all Negro hands, but had likewise failed to do so. As a reporter for the Courier-Journal accurately predicted, the unwillingness of law officers to intervene sealed the fate of the Birmingham blacks. Apparently encouraged by the failure of Marshall County officials to prosecute white caps who had warned and whipped black people, 100 men rode into Birmingham on March 8th and shot 7 men and whipped 5 others. John Scruggs, Scruggs, and his granddaughter died from wounds sustained during the raid. All of the blacks in that area were given another warning to sell their lands, resolve all of their personal and financial matters, and leave Birmingham within 10 days. Most of the blacks left for Paducah or Nashville, and in their rush for safety, they left behind household goods and farm equipment. A final story concerning the Birmingham blacks appeared in the Courier-Journal toward the end of March. Only six blacks remained since the notices to leave town were posted. A steamer from Marshall County brought in 17 black families and their household goods. In all, about 100 blacks got off the steamer when it arrived in Tennessee. Shortly after their successful removal of the Birmingham blacks, the night riders adopted the practice that seems to have been widespread in Kentucky during the first 2 decades of the 20th century and posted a sign near the railroad station in Marshall County telling anyone who somehow remained uninformed about the ousting of blacks that their community was for whites only. The words, "Niggers, don't let the sun set on you," were clear in their meaning, and against the backdrop of the destruction of property, whippings, and murders, these words must have invoked fear in Afro-Americans venturing in the county. Since the raid, Marshall County has had a reputation as a place where no blacks live, though this has actually become the case only in the last few decades. The United States Census for 1900 lists 348 black residents in Marshall County. But by 1910, just 10 years after the Birmingham raid, the number within the county had declined to 135. According to the 1930 census, only 62 blacks lived in the county. 30 years later, it had no blacks. It is obvious that the few blacks living in the area after March 1908 were not viewed as a threat to whites. They were, unlike the ones removed, employed as house servants and farm laborers. Occupation whites found necessary for their own well-being and appropriate for Afro-Americans. What happened to the land, the farm equipment, and the livestock left by the Birmingham blacks in their rush to vacate Marshall County? Given the scanty records and the same problems that exist when trying to discover how many Afro-Americans had owned land in Henry County in the 1870s, it is difficult to determine the number of Birmingham blacks who were landowners. It is known, however, that Nat L. Frizzle, Frizzell, of Birmingham, had on December 17, 1896, he purchased land from D.L. Nelson. The land, valued at $300, was to be paid off in $100 installments, plus interest, beginning March 1st, 1897. No one is sure what became of Frizzle's land and that owned by other ousted blacks. A prominent lawyer living in Marshall County today speculates that once the blacks had settled in surrounding areas, someone in Marshall County went to them and got them to sign away their land for little or nothing. About 2 weeks after the raid on Birmingham, a group of night riders terrorized the black residents of Golden Pond and several other communities. At Golden Pond, the mob shot into the homes of Afro-Americans. Then they went to the servant quarters of the Golden Pond Hotel and forced Tom Weaver, an employee of a tobacco company, out of bed. As noted earlier, they shot him. His death was more of a warning to other black workers to leave the area than a result of any offense he had committed. Because of this raid, some, but not all, of the blacks left the area. During the same time period, night riders also warned some blacks to leave the small community of Murray, M-U-R-R-A-Y, Murray, Kentucky. Several Afro-Americans had purchased homes in white neighborhoods, an obvious sign that they were getting out of their place. No figures exist showing how many blacks fled Western Kentucky in the wake of raids by the night riders. Clearly, Afro-Americans quit Birmingham entirely, and some left other areas. Leave my water alone. And some left other areas. As the Courier Journal noted when discussing the overall attempts by night riders to rid numerous areas in Western Kentucky of black people, the same policy has been pursued in Lyon County in the vicinity of Kutawa, Kuttawa, and along the Cumberland River, Cumberland. At Calvert, the Negroes were long ago driven out. That's what the Courier Journal said. Whose damn side are they on? Although it can only be speculated, blacks apparently defended their families and homes from attacks by the night riders to a degree not found when they were threatened with lynching. To be sure, blacks deplored the practice of lynching and saw it as a threat to their own well-being, but some blacks probably felt that the people lynched had brought troubles on themselves by being involved with white women or by challenging whites too aggressively. In other words, while there may have been some doubt about the guilt of a few of the blacks who were lynched, none existed about the blacks who were run off their property in Birmingham, Golden Pond, and other places in Western Kentucky. After the first raid on their community, Birmingham blacks prepared for other attacks. According to the Courier Journal, 3 night riders were killed by blacks during the raid on March the 8th. A letter to Governor Wilson from Judge W.L. Crumbaugh, Crumbaughh, of nearby Lyon County, substantiates the point that though blacks were eventually forced out of Birmingham, they had defended their homes. And this is what he said. I have learned that a man in this county saw the gang on its march to Birmingham, counted them, saw them as they returned, and one man was lying on his horse, head hanging on one side, feet on the other. Another was held in a saddle by the man riding behind. I had also heard through my Catawba friend that one man lives at home, both eyes out. 4 others are visited by a doctor from Catawba after night. The doctor crosses the river after all persons have retired, is gone about 3 hours, and returns to river ferries himself over, thinking himself unseen. There were 3 secret burials in this county and 1 in Marshall. Yet a week later, Crumbaugh wrote a second letter to the governor, explaining there was some doubt over how many night riders, if any at all, had been killed during the raid. Whether or not men were secretly buried is all but impossible to determine, since no one is sure exactly where the night riders lived. Undoubtedly, some of them resided in the areas close to the black communities in Golden Pond and Birmingham. But it's also likely that some had come from further away to take part in the raids like they did. In short, given the clandestine nature of the night riders, it is virtually impossible to know if members of this white mob were killed or severely wounded in the March 8 raid on Birmingham, and if these were the only fatalities suffered during raids on black communities. Within days after the last raid on Birmingham, a group of black leaders filed criminal charges in Benton, Benton, against 3 night riders. Additional charges were brought against Rob Wood for sending the threatening letter that had warned blacks to leave their homes. With justice extremely color conscious in Kentucky's courts, it did not surprise blacks or the night riders when the whites won acquittals. But nevertheless, blacks had forced the issue. Contemporary and scholarly accounts revealed that whenever charges were made in court against night riders, there was a strong possibility that some of their cohorts served on the juries. For instance, after the Lyon County grand jury was convened in December 1908 to investigate a series of charges against the lawless band, the county attorney informed the governor that at least 6 men chosen as jurymen had participated in raids. 3 fellows, according to good proof, which I have, were in the Eddyville raid. 1 that was in the Marshall County raid on Birmingham, and 2 that were in the Crittenden County raid, Crittenden. After settling in Illinois, Lee Baker, Nat Frizzle, and the Scruggs family, all former residents of Birmingham, hired prominent white lawyers to recover damages from the beatings they had sustained and the property that had been stolen from them. The blacks identified more than 30 men who had taken part in the raid. Their case was held in federal court in Paducah, since the blacks and their attorneys knew it would have been unrealistic to expect a ruling from a state court dominated by night riders. A year after the raid, Baker and Frizzle recalled with vivid details how they were tied and were beaten with a whip until it cut into the muscles of their legs. In a surprise move, several whites came forward to testify in behalf of the ousted blacks. Otis Black, a confessed night rider, told of the raid and identified all of the defendants as night riders. Arthur Griffin confirmed the validity of Black's testimony, saying that Dr. E. Champion, the leader of the mob, made him accompany the night riders and hold their horses while the Negroes were being whipped. A third white, Dr. Robert Overby, Overby, warned out of Birmingham for dressing the wounds of several blacks, also testified in Baker's and Frizzle's behalf. After hearing the evidence and being told that the defendants refused to offer a defense for their actions, the federal judge told the jurors to perform their duty and render a verdict not only sufficient to cover the actual damages suffered by the Birmingham blacks, but vindictive damages to any amount not exceeding $25,000. He would be surprised and disappointed, the judge warned the jury, if verdicts were returned for inconsequential sums of money. The jury heeded the words of the judge, awarding $25,000 each to Baker and Frizzle, the full amount requested. It is likely that the blacks did not receive these huge amounts, however. It is said the defendants against whom judgments were occurred have no property. Also involved in the suit was the Scruggs family, whose grandfather and infant daughter had died during the raid. However, the family members had been prevented from taking part in the deliberations because they were quarantined with smallpox in Illinois. Their case was to be continued. The exact outcome is unknown, but in all probability, it was resolved in favor of the Scruggs family. Within the Kentucky courts, only a handful of men were indicted and prosecuted for the many crimes committed during the Night Riders' 5-year reign of terror in Western Kentucky. The same scenario was played out in practically every county. The grand jury refused to return indictments against Night Riders, or on the few occasions when a member of the band was brought to trial, the jury was packed with his former associates. Dr. David Amos, Amoss, the person largely responsible for the start of the 2nd Brigade, was tried and found not guilty in Hopkinsville in 1911. All told, 3 men were convicted and sent to prison, each for only 1 year. It is doubtful that any blacks, including Baker, Frizzle, and the Scruggs family, recovered their property and goods. By contrast, in Mississippi, hundreds of men suspected of being involved in attacks on blacks were fined $25 and given suspended jail sentences of 30 days. Significantly, a number of men were found guilty of murder and received terms in prison ranging from 10 years to life. That only a few night riders were prosecuted and then found not guilty, or at most handed extremely light sentences, tended to encourage the return of the lawless band. As explained by a reporter for the New York Times, by 1915, the Night Riders had resolved to regulate the conduct of the community through intimidation, displace Negro labor with white, and fixed prices which merchants should charge for merchandise. In outlying areas of Christian and Crittenden County, farms, houses, and buildings owned by African Americans were riddled with bullets. Placards were posted on these farms, instructing the blacks to leave the area or suffer the consequences of remaining. 18 men were eventually arrested and arraigned on charges of being night riders and terrorizing blacks. All of the men were acquitted. After the verdict, a score or more black farmers, realizing that the law would not protect them, moved from the area. Several months later, the Night Riders attacked blacks living in Ohio County. One black, Peter Hart, Hart, was killed. Hart had received a death threat telling him to leave the area and had ignored the warning. Dozens of blacks, including Reuben Howard, Reubben, Howard, and his wife were flogged. They received a small measure of justice when the Ohio County Circuit Court indicted 60 men for being night riders. 2 night riders pleaded guilty, throwing themselves on the mercy of the court, and was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years in prison. They agreed to testify against the others, but the outcome of those trials is unknown. Regardless, as late as 1920, the night riders remained active. Upset over the steady decline in tobacco prices and lacking an effective means of protesting to the large tobacco companies, a small band of farmers in Mayfield, Kentucky, in Graves County, resorted to destroying crops and setting warehouses on fire. And as it happened previously, some of the violence carried over into renewed attacks on Afro Americans. The running off of blacks and the destruction or seizure of their property was not limited to the western part of the Commonwealth. Thousands of blacks, primarily from Alabama and Georgia, migrated to the eastern Kentucky mountains during the coal mining boom of the early 1900s. Although they accounted for only a small percentage of the population, these newly arrived blacks found racial segregation just as severe as in the Deep South. As explained by Ronald D. Eller, Eller, coal operators usually segregated the black population into colored towns consisting of at least desirable houses in the count. Of the least desirable houses in the count. Schools and churches were segregated, as were recreational facilities, restaurants, and saloons. In the coal mining community of Wheelwright, Wheelwright, one word, community officials made sure that no contact occurred between blacks and whites once they left the mines. The town had a black police deputy to control How Hollow, the Negro section of town. Wheelwright had 3 boarding houses, one for whites, one for foreigners, and one for blacks. How Hollow. The town had a black police deputy to control How Hollow, the Negro section of town. After the First World War, hundreds of Southern black men found good-paying jobs at the Louisville and Nashville Railroad Company, L&N, in Corbin, Corbin. Many of these Afro-Americans were employed as skilled laborers for the construction of a new railroad terminal in the southern part of the city. A major cause of the riot that occurred in October 1919 was white resentment of blacks coming to Corbin to work these relatively high-paying jobs. Local legend has it that Corbin was free of crime and vice until the arrival of the Southern blacks, when the city experienced numerous assaults and robberies. Whites also blamed black immigrants for the presence of prostitution and bootlegging. Vice is already in operation in Corbin long before blacks even came to that mountain community. About 9 o'clock in the evening on October the 30th, 1919, a rumor began spreading in the white saloons that A.F. Thompson, Thompson, a night watchman, had been robbed and stabbed by 2 unidentified Afro-Americans. Within an hour, a mob of at least 150 white men, all of whom were heavily armed with rifles, pistols, stones, and large pieces of lumber, took to the streets, and the rioting began. The men first went into the restaurants and office buildings, seizing the black employees and taking them to the train station. They then ventured into the black community and forced all of the black railroad workers to the depot. Any number of other blacks, seeing the approaching mob, fled Corbin on foot. When the L&N train arrived at 2:15 in the morning, an extra car was added, and all of the blacks who had been detained were loaded on. Mob leaders ordered the conductor to keep the blacks on the train until it arrived in Knoxville, 90 miles away from Corbin. The mob, however, was far from satisfied. Realizing that a number of black workers had escaped, some of the mob members spent the night searching for the blacks. Most were captured at the outskirts of the city. Other whites returned to the now vacant area where the blacks had been living and destroyed the tents, shacks, and boarding cars that had been home for the railroad workers. Having used the pretext that the criminal act of two black railroad employees justified the removal of all their fellow workers, the mob turned its attention to the Afro-Americans still remaining in Corbin, even though no one suggested that they were responsible for the assault on the night watchman or the crime wave in the city. The entire crew of 40 black employees of a Louisville contractor who had been constructing Center and Main Streets for the past 6 months was rounded up and taken to the train depot. The decision to remove the gray Negroes, as local whites contemptuously called them, meant that the only blacks left untouched were those who had been living in Corbin before the black railroad workers arrived. As reported in the newspaper, the Negro families who have been residents of the city for years are those of John Barry, Barry, Alex Tye, Tye, John Turner, Turner, and Emma Woods, Woods. Some members of the mob advocated allowing the family of John Barry, who had been a resident of Corbin 33 years, to remain, saying he was a good nigger. Others favored ridding the place of all Negroes. Ultimately, all of the black old-timers were allowed to remain. Meanwhile, the authorities had at last heard of the violence and arrived at the depot where the blacks were being held. Instead of freeing them and disbanding the mob, the police agreed that the blacks should be compelled to leave, though the police did inform the mob that further violence would not be tolerated. With the police now maintaining order, they had searched the Afro-Americans to make sure that none of them had weapons, but made no attempt to search and disarm the whites who had the weapons. Local officials, who had, of course, remained silent throughout the night, said that no state troops would be called since everything was under control. The work of deporting the Negroes progressed today without serious trouble, the newspaper noted. All told, as many as 250 black people, and maybe at least another 100 more, were forced out of Corbin by the white mob. Although they had agreed with the blanket indictment that the black railroad workers were responsible for numerous criminal acts, most local whites seemed to be appalled by the ouster, saying that the riot would hurt the growth of Corbin. Letters were written to the local newspaper calling for the arrest and prosecution of the men involved in the incident. Labeling the riot deplorable, the editor of the Corbin Times was nevertheless received to note that the riot was led by lower-class white people. Right from the start, there was speculation about the two unidentified Negroes whose alleged robbery had sparked the riot. Writing in 1981, a Corbin historian noted, later, it was thought that the blacks were not involved in the lawless act that triggered the incident, but that it was committed by two white men whose names were not publicized. And all of those alleged so-called rapes of white women were committed by white men. They just claimed and blamed it on black men. And it didn't matter to them. They did not care that or worry that the one who did assault them was running free. They didn't care about that. All they cared about was that a black person was accounted for the crime. A black person was set up and maimed or murdered for the crime. That was the main focus. These women had no concern whatsoever that the true people who assaulted them were still running free and able to commit these crimes again, even upon themselves. But as long as a black man served the purpose of the criminal, they felt it was okay. However, the Butner family, B-U-T, let's go back a line or two. What were we? Oh, we way over here. Letters were written to the local newspapers calling for the arrest and prosecution of the men involved in the incident. Labeling the riot deplorable, the editor of the Corbin Times was nevertheless relieved to note that the riot was led by lower-class whites. He was relieved that it was the lower-class whites, the poor white trash, who led this riot. Right from the start, there was speculation about the two unidentified Negroes whose alleged robbery had sparked the riot. Writing in 1981, a Corbin historian noted, later it was thought that the blacks were not involved in the lawless act that triggered the incident, but that it was committed by two white men whose names were not publicized. Corbin's white leadership may have been troubled by the forced removal of hundreds of innocent Afro-Americans, but they failed to adopt any measures to allow the safe return of the black railroad workers. In reality, of course, whether or not two blacks had committed the robbery and stabbing was secondary to the mob's aim of removing all blacks as job competitors. During the riot, a few whites had been sympathetic toward black domestics. Blacks, in the view of whites who knew their place. Lillian Butler. Lillian Butner. Lillian, Lillin. Butner, Butner. A young girl at the time of the riot recalls, my father was tipped off by a white man. He hid us across the street with a white family. The Negroes they found were herded into pens like cattle and shipped off on trains. Long after all hostility over the incident had ended, no blacks moved into the city. Corbin had room only for those African Americans performing service jobs. For instance, Mrs. Butner's husband worked at the Wilbur Hotel for more than 40 years. Wilbur. And as she explains, he encountered no racial problems. However, the Butner family and most of the other blacks employed in Corbin lived in London, 12 miles away, and commuted to work. From the end of the riot to the present, the only blacks living in Corbin had been a handful of servants. And in 1988, some 30-some years after, 30-some years ago from today, some 30-something years ago, maybe 35. And in 1988, only one of these families still remained in Corbin. Which family? As a way of making sure that other blacks knew that they were not welcome in Corbin, local whites adopted the practice that seems to have been used in an undetermined number of Kentucky cities. They put up a sign saying, "Niggers don't be here when the sun goes down." You still find them signs somewhere in some of them little hick towns. The sign was displayed in Corbin until the 1960s. What happened in Corbin was not an isolated incident. White people in at least 2 other areas of eastern Kentucky forced black people to leave in the 1920s. Unfortunately, the paucity, P-A-U-C-I-T-Y, unfortunately, the paucity of historical data coupled with the unwillingness of white residents to discuss these incidents have resulted in very little coming to light about these violent incidents, beyond the obvious fact that blacks feared to remain in a given area. In the absence of blacks in Ravenna, Ravenna, a small community in Estill County, Estill, not Esther, Estill County. One can only speculate about why white people compelled black people to leave the area. Historically, few blacks have lived in Estill County. The 1896 census lists 581 blacks, composing 5% of the total population, and 10,255 whites. At the start of the century, the number of blacks had declined by more than 60% to 223, while the number of whites had increased to 11,446. Blacks in 1900 made up less than 2% of the population. 10 years later, the number of blacks had decreased by another 50% to 106, while whites had increased to 12,167. At that point, blacks were 0.9% of Estill's total population. Interestingly, however, the number of blacks increased by the time of the 1920 census to 204, or 1.3% of the population. Whether the increase in the number of blacks had anything to do with the incident that occurred in the county is unknown. In many instances, an increase in the black population, even one as insignificant as that in Estill County, led to trouble as whites felt that blacks were invading their communities, taking their jobs, and lowering the value of their homes. Also, considering that the 1920 census data were probably not collected until sometimes toward the fall of the year, that is, after the Ravenna incident, it is likely that the number of blacks had increased at an even greater rate in the county, leading directly to problems in the small community. When discussing the ousting of blacks from Ravenna, the Maysville newspaper said, and they said, all Negroes have been ordered out of this place because of sentiment against them. All Negroes have been ordered out of this place because of sentiment against them, following an attack of a Negro man on a white boy. The facts have not been fully disclosed, but the Negroes are leaving town without delay. By the time of the next census in 1930, the number of blacks had decreased to 145, while the number of whites had risen to 16,934. Blacks were once again less than 1% of Estill County citizens. In my opinion, whites moved to the counties. Whites moved to the spaces where they violently, murderously oust black people. That's where white people move to. When they find out that black people are forcibly being beaten, tortured, and ousted, that's where they move to live because that's how they feel. The brief newspaper account of the ousting of blacks from Ravenna does not reveal a significant fact about this small community. Like Corbin, the area had been selected by the L&N as the site for the construction of a large railroad terminal. This undoubtedly meant that black railroad workers had come into the area. Again, because of an absence of sources, the exact cause of the incidents at Ravenna can only be speculated. But it is revealing that the newspaper mentioned that a black man had assaulted a white youth, an incident similar to that rumored to have happened in Corbin. Surely the whites responsible for the forced removal of African Americans from Ravenna must have known that once the blacks had been ousted in Corbin, their employer, the L&N Railroad, had acquiesced in the matter. Only oral accounts remain about the removal of blacks from Cary, Cary, a small community in Bell County. Practically everyone living in that part of Kentucky labored in the coal mines. Blacks and whites worked on the same jobs for the same pay. Away from work, however, segregation was rigidly enforced in schools, churches, and public accommodations. As told by Jim Garland, Garland, a longtime resident of the area, whose narrative was recorded and eventually published, the 1923 Cary riot centered on a dispute between two men, one white and the other black, for the affections of a black woman. A shootout occurred, and the white youth, Gert Rourke, Girtroark, was killed. When informed of his son's death, the elder Rourke went berserk and began shooting at every black person he saw. Other whites quickly joined Rourke, and they decided to drive out all the black residents. As usual, the blacks' appeal to the authorities for protection was a waste of time, even though they had lived in Cary for many years and had not been accused of any criminal acts. My own feelings and those of my family were all in sympathy with the Negroes, but we were definitely in the minority. All we could do was help secretly. Going further, Garland said, "This was a sad day. I had known many of these people all my life. I had had them as customers when I sold newspapers. I had sold them blackberries. I had worked with them. I had gone with my mother to see their babies. Given only 2 days to get out of Cary, these people had to leave everything they had. One black, for example, was forced to abandon his 3 cows and 9 hogs. After being forced out of Cary, blacks continued to work in the mines in the area and live in the other nearby towns, but none moved back to Cary. Where Corbin, Ravenna, and Cary isolated incidents are part of a pattern of racial violence in eastern Kentucky. Blacks were part of the out-migration from the mountains that started in the late 20s, when the coal boom had become a bust. Like whites, Kentucky blacks moved to Detroit, Cleveland, Indianapolis, and other northern cities in hopes of finding jobs in industry. The desire to educate their children also led blacks and whites to move from isolated parts of the Kentucky mountains. There is no way of knowing, however, the number of blacks who left during these years under duress. It is not difficult to imagine that once layoffs started in the coal industry, any blacks still working came in for abuse from frustrated, unemployed whites. An incident similar in some respects to the Corbin riot occurred in 1924 at Dix River, DIX, in Mercer County, MERCER, the site of a dam construction. About 800 black men had been brought into the area to work on a huge project. Away from work, both white and black men spent their time gambling, drinking, and fighting, though usually on a segregated basis. On November 9th, 1924, Edward Winkler, Winkler, was killed by two blacks who were convinced that he cheated them at cards. However, white construction workers were told not that the men had been gambling and drinking, but that a group of unidentified blacks had killed Winkler during a robbery attempt. Always lying. As a white newspaper explained, incensed by the murder, a group of residents of the Dix River area and white construction workers invaded the campsite of blacks with clubs, sticks, pistols, and shotguns, and forced all of the 800 black workers to leave the camp. Just like at Corbin, where whites had invaded restaurants and office buildings to seize peaceful black people. At Dix River, the huge white mob attacked dozens of black people at the barbershop, at the movie house, forcing them to leave as well. The whites decided to march all of them to the railroad depot in Burgin, Burgin, several miles away, and they were ordered to remain in the depot until a freight train could be flagged down. Many Afro-Americans had sustained severe beatings. One man had his knee shattered, and several needed immediate medical attention for gunshot wounds. Indeed, after the police ended the riot by talking the white mob out of the idea of putting the blacks on the train, dozens of black men were treated at the hospitals. James Bond, BOND, investigating the incident for the Commission on Interracial Cooperation, reported that the black workers had been robbed of their clothing and other valuables and had been physically assaulted during the riot. Many of these colored people were found the next day in different sections of the country, wandering about days without sufficient clothing and in a highly excited state of mind. One white newspaper, the Lexington Leader, went to great lengths to explain that the vast majority of black workers were innocent of any wrongdoings. It was, the newspaper added, purely a massacre of that element of hardworking Negroes by that class of whites who carry a grudge and foment trouble when coming in contact with Negroes. As we have seen, the authorities usually fail to intervene when whites force blacks out of the area. After the Dix River riot, however, state officials and the construction company, L.E. Myers Company, MEYERS, moved quickly to end the disturbance and return things to normal. Within 24 hours of the outbreak of the riot, members of Troop A, 54th Machine Gun Squadron of the Kentucky National Guard, arrived in Mercer County. With the state troops protecting their living areas, practically all of the black workers returned to the construction site. Mercer County authorities arrested two blacks, Walter Chance and John Williams, known as Big Jelly Roll and Little Jelly Roll, for the murder of Edward Winkler. They charged a third black, Jack Johnson, with complicity in the crime. Denied bail, the men were held until the February term of the Mercer County grand jury. Eventually, 3 other blacks were arrested for their alleged knowledge of the murder. In a surprise move, the police arrested and charged with assault and other offenses more than a dozen white men who were identified as leaders of the riot. These whites were also held in jail until February. The grand jury released all of the whites, citing a lack of evidence. Charges against most of the blacks were also dropped. Indicted for murder, Chance and Williams were convicted and received prison sentences. Given the reality of black life in Kentucky and the legal lynchings that often occurred, going to prison instead of to the electric chair was a rather light punishment. That the black workers went back to the construction project at Dix River suggests a different attitude compared with earlier disturbances. In those incidents, whites let it be known that they would not welcome a return of the ousted blacks. By the mid-1920s, white leaders throughout the state agreed that steps had to be taken to eliminate mob rule. The beating of black farmers in isolated areas could be ignored or covered up. But an incident as blatant as the forced removal of 800 men could no longer be tolerated. Most important, however, the labor of the men at Dix River was necessary for the successful completion of the project. Obviously, some of the whites resented blacks working on the project and wanted them fired. But this disdain for African Americans failed to secure their removal. The company needed the workers, and had therefore assisted the state in providing police protection to ensure that the blacks could perform without the overt threat of violence. The November 1924 riot at Dix River might have been the last attempt by a white mob to force an entire black population to leave an area. This does not mean, however, that many of the other actions by whites to keep blacks in their place ceased. Individual blacks were still beaten and given warnings to leave their homes, just as other African Americans had experienced in Kentucky since emancipation. One of these incidents occurred in Hopkinsville in the spring of 1932, when Jim Hill, a black worker for the Moore Construction Company, had 3 teeth knocked out by L.J. Swift, the road boss. Hill immediately left the job and went to the county prosecutor to obtain an arrest warrant against Smith on a charge of assault and battery. The prosecutor refused to issue one, saying that Hill should work out a peaceable settlement with his attacker. Ignoring this advice, Hill brought a civil lawsuit against Swift. An all-white jury heard the case in court. Swift acknowledged striking Hill in the face, saying that the Negro had talked back and made threats against him. Swift's brother and several friends testified in his behalf, corroborating the testimony that the black man had made threatening statements. Hill's suit was thrown out in court. 1 week later, Hill was awakened by a rap on the door. After being informed that it was the sheriff of Christian County, he opened the door, whereupon pistols were stuck in his face. Hill was nervous, but he recognized almost all of the men in the mob before a sack was placed over his head. As Hill was being carried off, his wife appeared at the door with a lamp and a gun. The light was shot out of her hands. Hill was then tied down to a car. Worried that Hill's wife could recognize them, several men returned to the house, only to find that Mrs. Hill had made a successful escape. The men then drove into Tennessee, finally stopping in a deserted area. There the mob beat Hill with tobacco sticks till blood oozed forth from his body. In his heavy underclothing, blood soap stuck to his back. Although no bones were broken, his hands, arms, and back were beaten almost to a jail. The mob left Hill along the highway, warning him not to return to Kentucky. As he had indicated earlier when attempting to file charges against Swift, Hill was not easily intimidated. Despite the mob's warning, he returned home. Hill told Edward M. Bacon, Bacoyn, a white attorney, about his beating. Hill named T.J. Swift and Paul Street, a law officer, as the leaders of the mob. In the company of Bacon, Hill went to see the county judge, who was so sorry about the beating of Hill. He almost cried, but could not help him. The local prosecutor once again proved to be unconcerned, refusing to hear the facts of the case. Hill decided to appear personally before the Christian County Grand Jury when it convened in May. Word quickly spread that Hill had talked to the authorities and was determined to press the matter further. Dave Oates, one of Hill's attackers, visited the black man to verify his intentions of testifying before the grand jury. Hill replied that when appearing before the grand jury, he would name Oates as a member of the mob. After Oates left, however, Hill realized that no one would help him if the mob decided to return. Him and his wife immediately left Christian County for parts unknown. Hill, a man who had served his nation in the Great War, who had lived all of his life in the area, was forced to leave his home because the law would not protect his right to live peacefully in the then unsuitable named Christian County. In the then unsuitably named Christian County. In Middlesboro, one of the largest cities in eastern Kentucky, a black physician, Dr. I.H. Miller, was active in politics to the dismay of local whites. Miller demanded that white politicians be accountable to blacks and that deserving Negro political leaders be awarded with patronage positions. One evening, a mob kidnapped Miller and took him to a remote mountain outside of Middlesboro. Word of his seizure spread, and the police began a search for the black physician. Miller was found several hours later, severely whipped and barely conscious. Telling Miller that he had been too officious in politics, 10 men, all of whom he could identify, had administered the beating. Miller was provided with police protection at his home and office. Nevertheless, as a newspaper speculated, Miller would be compelled to leave town once the guards were removed because little could be done to prevent another attack and maybe his death. The plights of Hill and Miller show clearly what happened to those black Kentuckians whose actions were viewed as a threat to white supremacy. Neither man had committed rape, murder, or other offenses. Swift, of course, testified in court that Hill had threatened him. If that had been true, Hill would probably have been lynched instead of whipped. It is extremely difficult to know how long this harassment of individual blacks continued. Lynchings and murders often caught the attention of the public, but forcing a black to leave town could easily be swept from the newspaper. Compelling a black to leave a community could have occurred so often that the act might not have been deemed newsworthy at all. White mob rule proved to be very effective in the bluegrass state, as perceived black troublemakers and competitors were eliminated. And that's perceived. The Afro-Americans who remained knew that their farmlands, livestock, businesses, indeed, all they had accumulated could be taken away from them. Security was for white men. Tomorrow, we will begin chapter 5. This, as I said earlier, last night and earlier today, this is our book for racial reconciliation. These are our texts, books for racial reconciliation. I know all the time, all the love, all the building, all the marriage, all the babies we have amongst each other. That's not racial reconciliation. Just because you got some white kids, just because you got a white wife, a white husband, some mixed babies. That's not racial reconciliation. Just so you know. Peace and power to the people.